This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to refute skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. In recent years, some historians have raised questions about the major historical figures in the Old Testament, including King Solomon. These scholars, often called minimalists, operate on the principle that if we don't have evidence from outside the Bible for a given person or event, then he or it is probably only legendary. Here's one author's comment about the minimalists. They say that David and Solomon, as well as most of the figures and events presented in the Bible, were the fanciful literary creations of the biblical writers, with little, if any, basis in historical or archaeological fact. We can understand why they might doubt Solomon, since the Bible makes a number of remarkable claims about him. We're told that he was the wisest monarch of his time. 1 Kings 10:23-24 says, "So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart." We also read of his great wealth. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which came from the explorers, and from the business of the merchants, and from all the kings of the west, and from the governors of the land. 1 Kings 10:14-15. What is more, and quite surprising given the fact that the Jews in antiquity were not well known for seafaring, we read of his trade by sea. The king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish, at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. 1 Kings 10:22. We can't very easily make a judgment about Solomon's wisdom apart from the few examples the Bible provides. As for his wealth, another talk in this series deals with evidence for that. Here we will look at the question of his trading fleet. What would it have been like, and from where would it have sailed? Could there be any evidence for his seaport? The Bible's account is rather specific about Solomon's trade by sea. We read this in 1 Kings 9:26-28. King Solomon also built ships at Etzion-Geber, which is near Eloth in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea. And Hiram sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men. They sailed to Ophir, and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. Anyone familiar with the Bible will recall that the Jews were not really a seafaring people. Their ancestors, from Abraham on, had been nomads, caring for sheep and goats. Then they visited Egypt, and eventually became slaves there, forced to carry out Pharaoh's building projects. Moses led them out, and after a generation spent in the Sinai desert, they entered their promised land, eventually to become shepherds and farmers. Did they ever go to sea? Not so far as we know. Jonah's adventure is perhaps the only sea story from the Old Testament, and he went only reluctantly, fleeing God's instruction to prophesy to Nineveh, and he went in a foreign vessel. Besides their history as a people, we can see another reason why they were not accustomed to the sea. Israel's coastline has no natural harbors. King Herod the Great, in the 1st century B.C., finally built a great artificial harbor at Caesarea. It was a colossal undertaking and a great technological achievement, involving some of the earliest use of hydraulic concrete. But throughout the Old Testament, the Jews did not have their own port to provide trading access to the Mediterranean. Well then, if we look for evidence about Solomon's sea trade, what elements of the story could we test? There was Solomon's alliance with the Phoenicians, those trading folk who dominated commerce in the ancient world, and King Hiram of Tyre, there was reference to the ships and men, to the seaport, and to all that treasure that the trade produced. We might find a copy of a treaty between the kings, but that would be an amazing stroke of luck. As for the ships, the development of underwater archaeology since World War II has given us good tools to locate shipwrecks. Robert Ballard is the most famous name here. He found, among others, the Titanic, the Bismarck, the Lusitania, the Yorktown, and John Kennedy's PT-109. But few really ancient wrecks have been found, and none from Solomon's time. All that gold is a tempting idea, but most of the treasure of antiquity was looted again and again over the centuries. We have little chance of finding Solomon's treasure. That leaves the seaport, and there we may have a good opportunity. Seaports leave traces. We know where Eloth is, at the head of the Red Sea, now called the Gulf of Aqaba. That's where we can begin. There are, in fact, 2 harbors there now, Eloth and Al-Aqaba. However, they are modern harbors, and both of them are artificial, and neither of them has any ancient remains beneath them. Still, people have searched. In 1938, Nelson Gluck, who was both an archaeologist and a rabbi, announced that he had found Solomon's Seaport. Here's what he said. The whereabouts of Solomon's long-lost port of Etzion-Geber was for centuries an unfathomable mystery, because no one paid attention to the biblical statement that it was located beside Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom, 1 Kings 9:26. And that is exactly where we found it, in the form of a small sanded-over mound of Tel el-Khalifa on the north shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the eastern arm of the Red Sea. Nelson Gluck. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, scholars generally accepted that Gluck had found Solomon's Seaport. Unfortunately, however, the claim did not hold up. Benno Rothenberg, Gluck's former assistant, showed from further study that the remains did not date back to the time of Solomon. What's more, the water there at the head of the gulf was too shallow to accommodate sea-going vessels. That's why, in fact, dredging was required to create the 2 artificial ports that are there now. Seeing this evidence, Professor Gluck eventually withdrew his claim to have found Solomon's Seaport. Scholars are usually reluctant to retract what they have claimed in print, and Gluck's humility in this matter won him admiration from his colleagues. The editor of the Biblical Archaeologist observed, "Gluck's new ideas on the matter are extremely important, and they demonstrate a capacity to change cherished convictions gracefully." But there was another candidate for the port, Jezirat Faraun. It's an island just 7 miles south of the other location, and it had first been suggested by Friedrich von Schubert as far back as 1837, but no one paid much attention then. But in 1956, a brief survey of the island was done that brought it new attention. It's a small island, not inhabited now at all. There's a Muslim fort on it, and ruins from the time of the Byzantines, 5th and 6th centuries A.D., show that it was used even earlier. We might wonder whether there might be traces of something earlier still. It was Gluck's former assistant, Benno Rothenberg, and some students from Haifa Technion University who did that 1956 survey. They thought that they saw evidence that it might have been in use even before Byzantine times. They noted the remains of a wall around the island, what seemed to be a small natural harbor, and a quantity of pottery that they claimed was earlier than Byzantine. The next visitors were Elisha Linder and the Israel Undersea Exploration Society, who came in 1967. They were the first to do a preliminary survey underwater, and to conclude that the natural harbor was not entirely a natural formation. They also observed that the narrow channel between the island and the mainland to the west was quite sheltered. Even when the sea generally was choppy, this area was calm. It was clearly a natural anchorage. In fact, they found an old British naval chart that labeled the spot Faraun Island Anchorage. Travelers observed that it was the only natural anchorage in the Gulf. One member of the 1967 expedition was an architect named Alexander Flinder. That's him in scuba gear there. During those few days of exploration, he became fascinated with the island and its history. The plot thickens, as we say, because he would be back. He came back, then, in the following year, at the head of a combined British and Israeli expedition. Flinder was a fully qualified scuba diver who had done underwater archaeology at a number of sites. With him, he had enough volunteers to do some serious investigation. Under their hands, a number of significant details began to emerge. First, there was indeed a wall. It extended all the way around the island, even enclosing the harbor entrance. The harbor itself turned out to be a natural bay that had been artificially enhanced. It was protected by a breakwater that extended most of the way in front of the bay, leaving only a very narrow entrance, and the wall extended along the breakwater. Second, the crew found 2 ruined towers flanking the entrance to that small harbor. Third, the remains of 2 pylons were discovered just outside the harbor. Sailors call these structures dolphins. Their purpose is to give mariners something to tie up to while they're waiting for permission to enter a harbor. In the case of a harbor as small as this one, only 90 feet by 180 feet, they'd be especially important. Fourth, extending out from the mainland just opposite the island were the remains of 2 jetties. Though not noticeable from the landward side, they were easily visible from the air. And there was a 5th element as well. The team discovered the remains of a stone slipway at the northeast corner of the harbor. The rather small wooden boats used in antiquity would need to be pulled ashore periodically to be scraped, recalked, and repaired, and a slipway of this kind was ideal for such a purpose. Seeing all these elements, it's not difficult to reconstruct how the harbor would have functioned. Trading vessels coming up from the Indian Ocean or the coast of Africa would heave to in the sheltered area between the island and the mainland. Some would tie up to the dolphins as they waited for the opportunity to enter the small harbor, probably 1 or 2 at a time. Then, in the harbor, they would be offloaded, and their cargoes stored temporarily in warehouses whose ruins surround the slipway. Smaller boats then could transport the cargo from the island across to the jetties on the mainland to be loaded on carts and taken north to Eloth at the head of the bay. Well, then, it's clear that we have here the remains of a well-designed harbor complex, one that took advantage of the natural character of the island and the channel, and that was artificially improved to make it a superior facility. But the question remains, who built it, and when, and for whom? We find 2 major clues to the date of its building. First is this tower, which stands at the entrance to the harbor. The stonework is of 2 kinds. The upper portion is typical of medieval architecture and marks the tower as belonging to the Byzantine or Islamic periods. But the lower part of the tower is different. The stones there are what archaeologists call cyclopean, irregular blocks fitted together without mortar. They show that the original structure was much earlier. In fact, the base of the tower is square, while the upper part is circular. So, it was built well before the Byzantines came, and most likely a good 1,000 years before them. The other clue comes from the pottery found by the 1967 and 1968 expeditions. It was dated to various periods, but some, the earliest, dates from Iron Age 1. That is around 1000 to 900 B.C. In other words, it belongs to the time of King Solomon. These two clues point strongly to an identification of the facility as Solomon's Seaport. But there's another important clue as well, and that is the style of the harbor. The Bible tells us that it was not Solomon's people who built the port, but Phoenician workmen under the direction of King Hiram of Tyre. And the whole plan of this port is textbook Phoenician. As merchant princes of the Mediterranean world for almost 1,000 years, the Phoenicians had developed a standard way of constructing their ports, and it was different from what the Greeks and later the Romans did. They preferred to have their harbors on islands that were just slightly offshore. The actual harbor would be on the island, artificially enhanced if necessary, and fortified to protect it from marauders. Then there would be dock facilities on the mainland nearby. Hiram's home port of Tyre was like this, as we see from this map. It remained safely located on its island and surrounded by its wall, until Alexander the Great built a causeway out to it when he was besieging it in 332 B.C. Other Phoenician harbors around the Mediterranean show this same pattern. Here is Sidon, just to the north of Tyre, with its port on the narrow fortified island just offshore, and provided with dock facilities on the adjoining mainland. And a bit farther north, in the modern country of Syria, is another Phoenician port. You can see from this satellite photo that the harbor proper is on the offshore island, protected by a breakwater much like the one at Jezirat Faraun. And this island, too, was enclosed by a wall and provided with docking facilities on the mainland nearby. If we go a bit south of Tyre, we are in the modern state of Israel, and there is another Phoenician facility. It has the present name of Atlit. You can see that the northern of the two small islands is the port proper, fortified like all the others. And here's one more example. Just offshore from the large Mediterranean island of Sicily is the tiny island of Motia. The Phoenicians had a presence there, with a harbor at the southeast corner of the island. The remains of the wall that encircled the island can still be seen around the northeast portion of it. This is how the Phoenicians built their ports around the Mediterranean. So when King Solomon asked Hiram of Tyre for help in establishing a fleet and a port, it's not surprising that they built it in their standard plan. Hiram's naval architect would no doubt have surveyed the area on the Gulf of Aqaba, concluded that Eloth itself was not feasible, but that the island we call Jezirat Faraun, with its naturally sheltered anchorage in the channel beside it, had real promise. Some work to turn its natural sandy bay into a harbor, and to construct a perimeter wall around the island would give them the basics. Then a slipway, 2 jetties on the mainland, and a couple of dolphins to moor ships outside the little harbor, and it would be ready. And so, as the Scripture says, they sailed to Ophir, and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. If you have questions or comments about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.